Well, welcome back to the Azure Podcast. This is episode number 422, being recorded on the 26th of April, 2022, with special guest Thomas Stringer. I'm Sujit, and on Teams with me, we have Evan, Russell, and of course, our special guest, Thomas. We're going to get to in just a minute. But first, let's talk about some of the news that came out this past week in the Azure space. Believe I had a couple I can which I put in there, and this was related to app service, which I think we all can agree is the most popular service on Azure. It's the one that most people would start with for sure.
Networking,
Uh-oh.
nope. You start with networking first.
Actually, I am going to talk about networking as it relates to app service. So I'm glad you brought that up. So
Unplanned,
that,
a
yeah.
totally unplanned audience.
So app service, easy to get into, but if you want to use some of the networking features, especially private endpoints, the
Yeah,
more secure networking features of app service, you had to upgrade to a standard SKU or the premium SKU. The basic SKU, which is the cheapest, and most people who started the basic SKU didn't support that until now. And so now you can use the networking features all the way down to the basic SKU. So if you're just testing it out, you don't have to put a lot of money up front to try it out and still get that secure. They want you to be secure, right? They don't want someone, playing around with the basic SKU and not being as secure as they should be. And so this is a nice feature, I think, where even the basic SKU can have access to the networking features. The other thing with networking, I did say it was related to networking, Evan. The other news about networking and app service is that typically you would do it as a second step. So you would deploy the app service, and then you would go in and configure the networking. You couldn't do it as part of the initial flow. I mean, it's not a big issue, but technically there's a small period of time when you may be potentially exposed, who knows, right? Between the time you deploy it and the time you actually configure the networking. So now you can do it all up front, right? You can, as part of the initial deployment of app service in the Azure portal, there is now the feature to kind of configure your private endpoints, your VNets, right from that initial experience, so that you can do it as one deployment. And this has been extended over to the ARM CLI and PowerShell as well. So just
the
go
only
ahead.
thing that I was gonna say, the only thing I'll sort of pile on to this and point out that I love it when we do these kinds of changes, because it sort of preaches to our basic belief that you should be secure by default instead of having to sort of opt into it or pay for it or get extra. I mean, yeah, there's always going to be some sort of esoteric feature, not esoteric, but some more advanced feature that may not exist on a lower SKU. But some of the basic security stuff that comes with these capabilities, right, those are table stakes, right?
Yep.
And I think it's great to see us invest in making sure that's available to everybody, not just somebody that's has the money or whatever to buy the higher end SKUs at that point. So
Absolutely. Well, I think that's all the news we had. We're a little early this week on our recording, so we missed out the cutoff for the Azure news, which will come out tomorrow. But we'll cover that in the next episode. For now, let's turn the mic over to our special guest, Thomas. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us today. Please introduce yourself. Let us know what you do at Microsoft, what your passion is, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, awesome. So first off, I want to thank everybody, for having me here today. This is super exciting for me to be here and kind of chat about some of the work that we're doing on my team and in open source. So just a quick introduction of myself. My name is Thomas Stringer. I'm the software engineering lead of the open service mesh team here at Microsoft. And personally, I've been at Microsoft ever since 2012. Took a year off and went to work at a different company, but like many of us, came back and had many different roles here at Microsoft, from working in the field with some of our customers to, of course, now in product group. So yeah, no, the product that I work on, Open Service Mesh, it's I think it's really interesting how where it's positioned. And what I mean by that is the OSM team, the Open Service Mesh team, is part of the broader Kubernetes upstream team. And the reason I'm introducing our broader team is it really does a good job of illustrating what our charter is, not just with OSM, but also with Kubernetes upstream here at Microsoft. So I think the really good way to explain that is the broader team works to bring OSS to Azure and to Microsoft, and to bridge that gap between Azure and open source software. And of course, as the name indicates, we have a focus on Kubernetes and cloud native technologies. So that's our kind of our guiding light. Russell, you had a question?
Yeah, sorry. Can I just go right back to basics and
Yeah.
Open Service Mesh? The name, I've heard of it before, but I don't really understand what it is. So could you give a really level one?
Absolutely.
That was my exact question, Russell. I heard a lot of things in there, Thomas. I have no idea what you said.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes total sense. So now coming into my direct team, Open Service Mesh, right? So we develop a service mesh that it's open source software. So it is a project that's part of the CNCF, just like Kubernetes, just like many of these other projects. So what we do is we develop out in the open a service mesh, and a service mesh. That's always the big question, right? There's this service mesh industry. It's been around for quite a few years now at this point, but many people, not having lived in this world, it's a really difficult thing to kind of wrap your head around. And I'll be honest, like the two words service mesh don't really do much justice for it either, without kind of knowing some of what it does. So a service mesh is basically software that's layered on top of a Kubernetes cluster and the platform itself. And what it does is it handles some more specific scenarios that Kubernetes itself doesn't deliver, but is a very common application requirement. So the really common one, and the one I really love to talk about the most, is the easiest thing that you get right out of the box. And by the way, like this is not just OSM specific implementation. This is some fairly common service mesh functionality. You'll see this with Linkerd, Istio, and many of the other service meshes in the kind of in the landscape of the industry. So I really like to explain what a service mesh is based off of some of the scenarios, right? So, we're all application developers. We have lived in worlds where we need to handle some very complicated but really important challenges, such as TLS termination, right? Like, we have our applications talking together, whether externally, but in this case, internally within a cluster. We need to make sure that the communication happening between those applications is encrypted, and that we're exercising defense in depth, right? So now you have the application developer, and they're having to solve these really difficult problems. Not every programmer is well versed with things like TLS and how to set it up, but also importantly, dealing with things like certificate management, right? We're all used to those those 2 a.m. wake ups, or those big emails of certificates expiring, right? Like these are really common problems that not implementing them is surely not the right answer, right? And regarding the security aspect, we have this idea that, hey, our Kubernetes cluster, it's absolutely secure. I have this really nice wall around it, this, that, and the other thing. But in the current modern day, we really have to plan for defense in depth, right? So we have to say to ourselves, what happens when, not if, when there's a bad actor inside of our cluster, right? What happens if they're able to look at the unencrypted traffic between two applications that are running inside that cluster? So right out of the box, a common service mesh, much like OSM, can solve that problem by having transparent and mutual TLS between the applications. Evan, you had a question?
Yeah, no, I mean, as you're sort of thinking about this, as you delve into, you talked about TLS, you're talking about the mutual TLS. What I hear you describing is sort of a standard way of doing things, and me as an individual developer not having to worry about the complexity of doing it. Like certificates, you mentioned, is the great one. Like, I don't know, there's probably been some Azure outage at some point in the past that was related to certificates being changed or rolled over. Not going to go into the details there, but it's a thing, right? Everybody's seen it, to your point. that's a super hard thing to do. But what you're talking about is making it so I don't have to worry about it. I just sort of probably isn't quite as simple as checking a box, but I don't have to worry about the complexity. I can say, I want mutual TLS, or I want, certificate management, certificate rollover, and I just sort of say, hey, turn this on, and I'm done. And Open Service Mesh is handling that for me so that I don't have to understand all, because that stuff is like a whole PhD level exercise on its own to figure out what's the best way to do some of that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And Evan, you really hit the nail on the head. And you made a comment that maybe it's not as easy as, checking the box, but actually it really is. And that's why I really, it's one of those things where, OSM or any other service mesh, it really is as easy as checking the box. In the case of OSM, all you have to do is add your Kubernetes namespace to the mesh, and it'll start doing all of the piping and the wiring in the background. And we can chat a little bit more about what that looks like. But actually, kind of your example of the check in the box, it really is that simple.
That's
and
awesome.
it's definitely you check it and you can walk away and absolutely forget about it. You don't have to deal with things like certificate expiring. You don't have to deal with some of the complexities that are inherently part of this scenario. Go ahead, Sujit.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, well, why is it called a mesh? Like, is this like, various groups of applications talking to each other? Like, are they overlaid in some way? Like, I'm curious where that term mesh came from.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think like getting into the industry and really trying to wrap your head around the technology, that word also really confused me. And I think the way to sort of visualize the mesh is to think of it a little bit as a spider web, right? So you have the Kubernetes cluster and you have all of the different pods and applications talking to each other. So there's already inherently a level of connectivity there. But what we do is we add a layer on top of that Kubernetes cluster, and then we create our own mesh. And you can almost think of it as creating our own network between the pods. And again, we can talk about the implementation. I think it would help visualize that a little bit because at the end of the day, all of these constructs and, mutual TLS, this is just one of many. But for instance, we have a lot of other features such as having a layer of security for access policies saying, hey, this service can talk to this service, right? By being very declarative about, really the principle of least privilege, like, hey, you don't need to talk to this service, then it's denied by default, right? So if you kind of think of it as this secure network layer on top of Kubernetes and a select amount of pods and namespaces being able to speak to each other, you can start to sort of visualize that spider web network and that mesh on top of that. Go ahead, Russell.
Yeah, so that's great to give you a picture of what's going on with OSM versus Kubernetes. Where does AKS and Azure Container Apps fit alongside this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I can't speak on behalf of Azure Container Apps, but regarding AKS and Arc Kubernetes clusters, Arc connected Kubernetes clusters, we really kind of have that easy button for OSM in Azure, right? So the implementation details there are with AKS, we have an OSM add-on, right? So we live in this world, like some of us, we live in this CNCF world where we're, super passionate about Kubernetes and all these other really interesting products. And we keep up to date on, the latest release version, and, we understand the product very well and the release lifecycle and that type of thing. But like the reality is that's not every AKS customer. That's not every Azure customer. So by shipping OSM and a service mesh as an add-on for AKS and an extension for Arc Kubernetes clusters, we really allow the other users to just hit the install button and walk away and forget about it, right? Now we have a managed service mesh for our AKS users, right? The people that don't necessarily want to have to deal with upgrading or dealing with the life cycle of the product itself. They install it and they walk away. They really don't care all about how it's managed as a product itself. So great question.
That sounds like my kind of service. Install and walk away.
I want to make sure we're using I understand the way the terms are playing together, right? So Kubernetes, open source, we we from an Azure perspective, we have an Azure Kubernetes service that allows you to not have to worry about all the complexities that go with building and implementing your Kubernetes cluster. And then we have OSM, Open Service Mesh, that sits on top of Kubernetes to add some of this management pieces. Is this a part of AKS that we're open sourcing as well, or is this sort of a separate project that just works really well with AKS, but it also works everywhere else? Like help me sort of put these pieces together in terms of what part, because I think I'm sort of like Russell. It sounds like from a infrastructure perspective, I like to set it up and say I'm following best practices and let the best practices protect me instead of having to know all the pieces. If I set up OSM, do I now have to manage OSM and now I have to keep up with, maybe I don't have to keep up with the certificate piece in OSM, but I got to keep up with OSM, right? Like what part do I own versus what part is managed for me?
Yeah, that's a really great question for you. So if we're talking in the scope of running OSM as an AKS add-on, you don't have to manage any of it unless you
that
run
checkbox and I'm done.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. It's that, again, it's that checkbox that, if you take the add-on route, which we absolutely recommend for AKS users, you don't manage any part of it. In fact, you likely would not even know that it exists unless you listed out the pods in the cluster, right? So,
okay.
you would have your OSM CLI on your local machine. That's how you interact, control, configure, reconfigure the service mesh. But again, these are admin tasks that are likely one and done, and you kind of move on with your life, right? So the parts that you manage as an AKS user, it's really nothing, right? So you bring up a really great question though, Evan, and you're hinting at something that's really an important aspect, right? So we have this open source project. You go to GitHub right now, and it's right there. Like we develop it right out in the open, and then you have the AKS add-on, and it's very worth mentioning that these are one and the same products, right? So when we release something in upstream in open source, we then turn around and then we work with AKS to send that update to the AKS side. And what we get there is we get that seamless automatic upgrades with AKS. The end users don't need to know that you're running OSM 1 and it's being upgraded to 1.1 or whatever. It doesn't make a difference, right? So yeah, it's really that total ease for the users, looking for something that's supported, looking for something that's completely managed, something that they don't need to deal with or work with. Because at the end of the day, we already all have enough to deal with, right? Especially when you're working in the Kubernetes world. AKS makes a lot of things super easy, but there's a lot of considerations. There's a lot of Monday morning checks, right? We want to make our service mesh not that, right? So hopefully that kind of gives some indication on the driving force.
Yeah, Thomas, I'm curious, like you were going to talk about the implementation. I know in some cases these things are implemented as sidecars with the pods. Is that how it is here? And does the application need to do anything special to make it work with OSM, or is this like, oh, I don't really care, whether OSM is there or not?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and you hit the nail on the head. We do utilize the sidecar implementation, right? So to get a little bit deeper into the implementation, the way we do this and the way we kind of have all of these scenarios unlocked is we inject a sidecar into all of the pods that are participating in the service mesh. And the actual sidecar that we inject is what's called Envoy. And Envoy is it's a layer 7 proxy. It's actually also another CNCF project, another open source project that's developed out in the open, high usage across across many clouds, across a lot of open source projects themselves. And so what we do is we inject this proxy into all of the pods that are participating in the service mesh. And what we do is we do some networking rerouting so that all of the networking connections, instead of going from the application containers, now they're being proxied, not to overuse the word, but being proxied through Envoy. And that, if you think about it, it's all of these sidecars that are connected, and that's a good way to visualize the mesh itself, right? So now we have all of these interconnected proxies that have a layer of dynamic configuration, allowing the administrator to not just control who can access what, but when certain things can be accessed and what percentage of traffic, and a lot of the other features that we support. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, yeah, it does. And, it leads me to wonder about, you mentioned Linkerd, HCO as being other, I guess, maybe some of them are commercial almost offerings. And we have this, which is open source. What's our message to our AKS users to say, hey, how do you decide which is the right option for you?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And a lot of other service meshes, Istio and Linkerd, these are the two service meshes that are typically on the front page news, right? And great implementations. A little bit sometimes, the implementations and the feature sets are a little bit different, implemented a little different way. But I typically say to our AKS users and to our Azure users, like OSM is the service mesh that absolutely should be running the best on Azure, right? It's the thing that you don't have to deal with. Linkerd, Istio, these are great, but if you install those in your AKS cluster, it's on you to manage those, right? When there's a Linkerd update, it's on you, the administrator, to figure out how to do the upgrade, to make sure there's no outage, to make sure there's, anyways, it's yet another problem that you have to solve and have to deal with as the administrator. So the big point for our AKS users is this is the service mesh that you install and forget about it.
I like what you said in there, and I maybe missed the exact words, but like runs best on Azure, right? We're like a lot of things that we're doing these days. It sounds like you're taking the path that says, listen, we're releasing this for anybody who uses Kubernetes to use. We think it's the right experience. We think it's a great experience, but at the end of the day, we feel like this will run best when you pair it up with AKS because of how tightly we're working with that team to make sure that everything does go seamless for you. But just because you're not using AKS doesn't mean you should ignore Open Service Mesh, and vice versa. Just because you're not using Open Service Mesh doesn't mean you shouldn't. If you've got some reason that you want to use Linkerd, go ahead. We still want you to use AKS, but at the end of the day, we feel like this is the best combination.
Yeah, exactly. And Evan, that's absolutely a really important point, right? Because we live in these two worlds, right? Half of the conversations are about Azure and how it works in Azure, and great, that absolutely is something that is a huge point of focus for us. But it's also worth mentioning and emphasizing that regardless of Azure, this is an open source service mesh. And this is something that we're developing out in the open, right? Yes, a lot of the contributors are on my team and at Microsoft, but we welcome and we definitely we look forward to external community contributors to the project. So we are very much an open source first product, and then with the consideration of making it also the best service mesh in Azure. So absolutely, those are really good points.
How do I go about troubleshooting this? Sorry, just quick question on that. How do I go about troubleshooting like an installation? Let's suppose I did apply the add-on for OSM, and all of a sudden nothing's talking to each other, right?
Yeah.
It was my question too, so that's good. Thank you.
No, that's a great question. So first off, it is on the team and for the product itself, making sure that supportability is really top notch is one of our guiding lights here. It's one of our P0 items, right? Because at the end of the day, we find that service mesh users and Kubernetes users, generally speaking, they're typically pretty good, self-diagnosers, right? And it's the crowd that's kind of aimed towards this realm is typically very competent, right, with these technologies. So it's really important that we kind of develop and we add parts of the product that allow for self-serve diagnostics, right? And for that particular example of, hey, like I add the service mesh and all of a sudden things start breaking. That shouldn't be the case, but if you were able to kind of look at the configuration and see some of the settings that would be kind of controlling, the access policies between the pods, that would give some indication. But we are currently working on adding a lot of that tooling so that you run some diagnostics directly from the OSM CLI, and it tells you, hey, this pod can't talk to this pod for this actual reason. So without being a service mesh expert, without being an Envoy sidecar expert, and even without being a Kubernetes expert, we're trying to really bridge that gap and make it really easy to just run a single command and have a pretty obvious output of why something isn't doing the way you think it is.
And outside of debugging and problems, you're adding quite a few features here in terms of the networking and the traffic shifting and all the rest of it. Is there any degradation on performance as a result? Is there anything we need to look out for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I really like that you asked that. So, the reality is we're adding bits to the endpoints between applications, right? So there is going to be a certain level of impact. But I can tell you that in the past couple months on the team, we've been working through performance benchmarking, and we went even as far to publish those metrics on the Open Service Mesh website. So for anybody that's listening to that and is really interested in that, that is absolutely a huge concern. And a huge consideration. So I would just ask that, take a look at our docs website on Open Service Mesh, and you'll be able to drill into those specific performance indications and benchmarks. The good news is I can say kind of from the 50,000 foot view, it's a very digestible impact for given what it provides. So for specific numbers, though, definitely take a look at the documentation. We ran some really interesting experiments.
That's great. I just wanted to maybe ask one last question. And what are some of the things that we can come to expect in the future with regards to the integration between AKS and OSM? Is there something in the roadmap that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we develop everything out in the open, and with that being said, we also plan everything out in the open. So for anybody that is interested right now and in the future, I urge you to go take a look at the OSM project in GitHub. But yeah, we have a handful of features that we're looking for with dealing with automated root cert rotation for scenarios where you need to kind of change up the whole trust chain in case there was something that was leaked or there was an issue there. Also, we're working on integrating with Azure Key Vault and kind of making that living in Azure story even better there. So these are problems that we're absolutely trying to solve. And the other thing that I think is worth mentioning when we're talking about roadmap and things that we're trying to deliver here, we're at the stage with the product. So we went GA in AKS in November, so just a few months ago. We just released V1 in upstream probably about a month, maybe a little bit more than a month ago. Just last week, we went GA with the Arc extension. So this product, it absolutely is production ready, but we're also at the stage where we're taking a lot of user and a lot of customer feedback. So if we have customers that say, hey, we would love to use OSM, but if only it could do this, like that comes directly to product group ears for us. So we're absolutely in the stage of unblocking customers for adoption, and again trying to be that best service mesh in AKS and in Azure. So the roadmap is out there, but is also really heavily influenced by people that we're trying to unblock for their usage.
Yeah, Thomas, thank you so much for sharing all these insights with us
Absolutely.
today. If you have any, getting started documentation or tips that you'd like to share with our listeners, send them over to me, and we'll add them along with the recording of this episode.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I really enjoyed my time here today, and looking forward to future episodes.
Yeah, no, this is great, Thompson. Don't feel like, I think you mentioned, I can't remember if you mentioned it on air or not, but you're a listener as well as now you're a presenter. Now that you've broken that barrier, you got to come back.
Absolutely.
In the future, come back
Absolutely.
for more stuff. So
exactly. Looking forward to the next time for sure.
okay, awesome. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.